In this video, I'll show you how to find refrigerant leaks in your car or truck using AC UV dye, which is this little bottle right here. I'll also talk about a couple of other methods you can use to detect refrigerant leaks also. So let's get started. So one very important thing to note is that AC systems are closed systems. That means you should never drop the pressure out of spec throughout its life as an AC system. If you have a drop in pressure, usually, and 9.999 times out of 10, you have a refrigerant leak and it needs to be addressed. The tiniest leak, whether it's pinhole sized or a huge rupture in an AC line, they're both just as important as each other really. You should never have a drop in pressure. The thing is, AC systems, moisture and contaminants really kill these systems. The last thing you want is your compressor to fail. Inside the AC system, there's PAG oil which runs throughout the system. It's designed to lubricate the compressor and any moving parts. The thing is, when water and contaminants get into that oil, it can generate more heat in the compressor, and it's just a matter of time before something fails. If something like a compressor fails, it sends tiny metal particles throughout the whole system and can actually get clogged up in the condenser and ruin parts you wouldn't otherwise need to replace. So something like a small leak is better addressed right away. Just do not hold off on things like this. So for UV dye leak detection, you don't really need much stuff. You need a small bottle of UV dye right here, but you may also have dye in your system, which I'll show you how to find out very soon. You'll need a UV light, and this will help you actually see the leaks. And also optionally, depends how big the leak is, some yellow glasses here. This enhances what you see. So if it's a really small leak, I highly recommend these. If it's a large leak, it'll be easy to spot without these glasses. And lastly, you need a way to actually get the refrigerant and dye into the system. I have some AC manifold gauges here, but you can use a standard can of refrigerant with end and just fill on the low side here. So this is somewhat optional, but you will need a way to get this dye into the system. And for me, I have manifold gauges. For you, you can use this or refrigerant mixed with the dye, which comes in a can ready to go. So if you don't have a set of AC manifold gauges, you can get something like this, which is the refrigerant mixed with the UV dye, and it comes with a dispenser right there, so you can refill it on the low side. So before we get started with the UV dye method, let me talk about a couple of other methods you can use to find refrigerant leaks. So there's something called a refrigerant leak detector. You can get them really cheap for around $70–80, but they can go up to a few $100s. What it is a small device that sits in your hand, and it's got a wand, and it just detects refrigerant in the air. That's really all it does. Now these are useful for a couple of reasons. One, just for detecting leaks. Now Freon is around 4 times heavier than air, so it will just sink underneath the car. So when actually doing checks for this, always go under the car because it sits down here. And when it detects a refrigerant leak, it will just beep and you can sort of see the levels it detects in a good one anyway. Now the pitfalls for this is that, well, the UV dye method is a lot cheaper and a lot easier in my opinion to actually see the leaks, which we'll get onto shortly. However, it does have its benefits when having leaks in the evaporator. Now the evaporator is a part of the AC system that sits between the passenger compartment and the engine bay here, so between the firewall and the passenger compartment. You can't actually see it visibly without removing some of the dash components in the car. Now with a leak detector, you can actually wand the passenger flooring to detect leaks there without actually removing anything. So that has its benefits here. However, if you find the leak without even having to go in there, then it might be a step you don't need to do anyway. So I'm just telling you what exists so you can look at your options and think about them. Now if you're doing any kind of AC work and you have to evacuate the system to recharge it, then you'll probably own a vacuum pump. If not, I'll link it in the description below. I also have many other videos on AC work explaining in basics what AC is, how to evacuate your system. Again, I'll link those below too. The purpose of this video is just to talk about the UV dye and how to handle that. So I will skip some steps with the pump and things like that, but not to worry. With a pump, when you evacuate your system, you pull a vacuum on it and that boils all the moisture out the system before you can recharge it again for AC use. Now what happens is when you pull a vacuum, you're creating negative pressure in all these AC lines here. if you leave the pump attached for a few hours or even overnight, it'll actually have a negative pressure here, and it sits around 30 right here. And if it doesn't sit around 30 on the gauges here, then you know you have a leak. It doesn't tell you where the leak is, but you know you actually have a leak, so it is something to consider anyway. So that's just another method. It doesn't tell you where, but it tells you if you have one. So now we've discussed some methods of leak detection. Let's proceed with the UV dye leak detection. Now, depending on your circumstances, you may already have UV dye in your system. This is up to the manufacturer of the vehicle, so it depends on the year, make and model. You can look it up in the service manual, or you can actually test yourself relatively easy. So in my case here, I have a very small leak. It's actually holding pressure, but if I try and recharge it with refrigerant, it'll leak out to, around 30 psi and stop leaking. So I know it's going to be the tiniest leak here. So in my case, I do have some pressure in the system, and what I can do is just tap this shrouder valve and check for the presence of dye. So in this instance, it's just a case of tapping this shrouder valve on the low side port here, just tiny. I'll actually show you under a UV light so you can see a lot better, and just checking for residual UV dye around this area here. If it actually luminesces under UV light, then it's safe to say you already have dye in the system. So if you have a low side port that looks something a little like that, then good chances are you might have some dye in the system. You see how it's luminescing. It's quite hard to see with the camera, but that's a good indication you already have some sort of dye in the system there. So as you could see under the UV light there, that's what it looks like if you have dye already in the system. It's quite easy to check. So even if you have no charge in the system, you will still have PAG oil, which is designed to lube the compressor, and it actually gets carried around the whole AC system with the refrigerant. Now the dye itself actually mixes with the PAG oil and takes it around the system. So even though you have no refrigerant charge, you will still have some residual dye in the system, just if you're wondering about that. So let's talk about the dye itself. Now I have a set of AC manifold gauges, so adding straight dye is really easy for me. I'm just going to suck it in with a bit of refrigerant, job done. Now if you don't have the AC manifold gauges here, you can get that can which has the dye pre-added. You can just add it in on the low side port. It's not a problem. So if purchasing straight UV dye like this one here, this is a 1 ounce bottle. You only need to add 1/4 of an ounce. That's all you need to do. When adding dye to AC systems, if you add more than 1/4 of an ounce, it can actually adversely affect cooling and your system as a whole. So when adding this, make sure it's only around 1/4 of an ounce. Also make sure it's compatible with your refrigerant type. On this car it's R134A. And lastly, you can get these for oil, coolant, and all kinds of different liquids, but make sure it's actually for AC as well. So before you do anything at all, what I like to do is actually check the system. You can do this at night time with the glasses if you already have the dye in, or you can just do a check in the day. The thing is, you don't really want to put dye and put effort into, partially charging the system, and the leak is really easy to spot. That's the last thing you want to do. So a common area of leaks are these low and high side ports here where the shrouder valve has failed here. So these are very common. There's a low side here. This is a Saturn view, but your circumstances or configuration may be different, but the principle is the same. And there's the high side shrouder valve there, so they're common for leaking. So with a little bit of charge there and maybe a bottle of soapy water, you can identify leaks quite easily in these valves right here. So now you've checked the shrouder valves, just check all the AC lines here just for nicks or where they've been rubbing against anything. Another common one is O-rings and washers and gaskets that actually hold the AC lines together. Follow it all the way down, all around the system. So this is the low side. Literally follow the pipe all the way along as far as you can. Check for every single fitting. You can see where it joins onto rubber here. It's common to get leaks right here. Follow it all the way along where it goes to the evaporator in the car. All the way out on the high side. Just follow all the lines. Just check for anything obvious. Because we may not even need to do this AC dye step. Check the condenser at the front. What can happen is rocks can fling up and hit things on your condenser, which is right inside here. Now this is a lot easier to see under UV dye, but it's just something you might be able to visually check first. And coming out of the condenser back onto low side here. And we also have a receiver dryer behind the headlight here, so check the fittings on that. It's quite hard to see, but under a UV light and night time you can actually see an AC line through there. But yeah, under UV light and with some darkness, you can identify a leak through this crack. It will glow quite brightly. So now we've done like a dry run over it, we can't really find the leak. Let's get to adding the UV dye so we can actually try and find this what could be a tiny leak. One of the last steps you should do before actually adding the UV dye or refrigerant mixed with the dye is to actually remove residual dye or anything like that with brake parts cleaner. Now the last thing you want is a false diagnosis. Say you already have dye in the system and it's you know, pooling up below the compressor or something like that. It could be an old leak, maybe someone fixed it ages ago, or maybe it's leaked down from something else. So it's always good to start with a clean canvas. Go around the whole AC system, use your UV light at night time with the brake parts cleaner and clean up any UV dye that you see. When we add our UV dye into the system, we want to make sure that any UV dye outside of the system is through a leak that we did and it's nothing old or nothing confusing with an old job or anything like that. So that's why the brake parts cleaner is a really good step, just so we start with a clean canvas. So I'm going to add the UV dye into the system here. If you're not familiar with recharging a system or anything like that, I'll link the videos in the description below. I've done this before, even on this exact car, so it'll be easy to follow along. So with the AC manifold gauges here, adding the dye is relatively easy. We can just add it into this refill port here. So literally just pour 1/4 of an ounce into this hole right here, and that will sit in the line right here. Then we're going to connect it to the refrigerant can. We're going to purge the yellow line, and then we're going to refill it by opening the low side valve through the low side port right here. So on this bottle here, we can easily see how much 1/4 of an ounce is. So we're just going to run it down to this line right here. When adding the UV dye, it might be easy just to crack this line right here. That way when we add the dye, the air can escape and it's just not pooling in the top of the refill line. So we've added our 1/4 ounce here, you can see right in there. So now we're going to connect our can of refrigerant onto the end of the refill port. So we've attached our refrigerant can to the end of the refill hose here. And we've also got our dye in the hose itself, so we're just going to purge the air using the shroud valve because we don't want air in the system. We're going to use safety glasses, we might as well use these, we have them. And also avoid breathing in refrigerant, that's the last thing you want to do, it's really not good for you. And again, if you don't have the can and manifold gauge set, you can just use the refrigerant with the dye pre-added and add it in the low side port. So that's what we're going to do now. So when purging the air, not refilling, purging, it's easy to hold it upside down here. That way we get the liquid refrigerant coming out here. If you tend to have it upwards like this, then you'll get air coming out of here and you don't know if it's the refrigerant in a gaseous state or the actual air from the line. So a little tip there. So when purging this, because it has the dye in, do it very carefully, very calmly. Don't just jam it in, otherwise you'll get a nice UV dye shower. Now the line's purged, let's just recharge the system with the dye. So adding the UV dye, it has to circulate throughout the whole system. You can't just put it in the low side port with the compressor clutch not running and it just pools there in one spot. AC dye will pool in one spot. You need to send it throughout the system, which means we need to run the AC on this vehicle. To run the AC on any vehicle, the compressor needs to be running and the clutch needs to be engaged. If you're not familiar with a compressor and clutch, again, check out our other videos. It's all in the compressor, real quick, is down here. So the compressor is right here, the clutch is this front piece here. This needs to be engaged, so when we press AC in our passenger cabin, the clutch is running and it's actually cycling the UV dye throughout the system. So when adding the UV dye, let the AC run 5-10 minutes. The longer really the better, but you also do not want to run this compressor with a low charge. It can damaging it, especially when jumping a compressor relay. Now, if you're trying to add this refrigerant and dye into this system and your compressor clutch won't engage, well, I have a video on that exact thing. I'll link it in the description below. It's basically jumping a relay, something like that, in order to force it to run. But you do not want to do this for a long period of time. So now we're going to add our UV dye into the system. We've connected all our gauges, we've opened up all the valves on the low and also the high side of the AC system. We want the dye to circulate all the way through the high and low side so we can detect for leaks both in the low and high side and pretty much anywhere in the AC system. So we're going to leave this running for a few minutes. We have our can connected in the upright position. We don't want to refill it like that, otherwise we're drawing liquid refrigerant straight into the compressor, which is the next stop along from our low side refill port. We don't want liquid refrigerant going into the compressor, it can slug it. I've never seen it firsthand, it's something which is talked about, but you know, you don't want to take any risks, you can fill it like that just fine. So we have our manifold gauges set. These readings aren't accurate because the vehicle is not started and the compressor clutch is not engaged, so ignore these readings for now. We're going to start the vehicle, we're going to put it on max AC. So I've just started the vehicle now, we're going to put it on AC, max AC, so all the way up. Engage the AC there. We can see our compressor clutch isn't running, so we're going to jump the relay on that. We're going to open up our low side valve here, that way we can draw the refrigerant into the system. And now we're going to have to jump the compressor clutch to actually get a reading and draw refrigerant into the system. So let's jump the compressor clutch. We should also jump these cooling fans in an ideal world here. The last thing we want to do is overheat the condenser. So there's the clutch engaged. So it's now running. So you can see now the compressor clutch is engaged here. We're getting more normal readings here. This looks a lot more normal. It's maybe a slightly slow charge, but I think this is a good indicator of how big the leak is. So on my system here, it's very tiny. And you can see through the looking glass here, the UV dye is slowly working its way into the system. When removing the low side coupling from adding the UV dye, just clean up any residual UV dye here to prevent a false diagnosis. So it's night time, as you can see, the best time of the day to check for leaks in the AC system. Let's get to it. So we're going to put on our UV enhancing glasses, and we're going to get our UV light here and see if we can find the leak. Again, the enhancing glasses, they're not really necessary unless the leak is really small. It really shows up well. You can, perfectly see a leak without the glasses, but it does help. So just like we did before, we're going to follow the AC line here all the way around the car. We did it in the daytime earlier in the video, so it's pretty much the same again at nighttime. So start with the low side and work it all the way along. So follow the pipe all the way along, all the way at the back, which goes into the evaporator. Check every single thing. I'm not going to go through it all on the video, but you get the general idea. Don't forget to get the caps off as well. Make sure the shroud valves in here aren't leaking. That's the most common sign really of leaking there, just a leaky shroud valve. Follow it all the way along, all around the condenser the best way you can. So through the rail here again. Check absolutely everything on this condenser, because rocks come up and nick it. It's a really common symptom. Go underneath the car, check absolutely everything. But I did look a little earlier, and it looks like this is the culprit right here, this coupling here. So this right here, you can see just in there, you can see that, the tiniest leak, very tiny. And that would just be an O-ring or something like that, something very small. A very small leak can bring down a whole AC system. And again, we need to diagnose this now before anything else goes wrong here. You can see on the other side of the coupling as well, it's all the way around, so it looks like the O-ring is pretty much gone in there. So that's what we will be replacing here. Just because you found one tiny leak, check the whole system. It might be multiple leaks. You never know. If it's an old car with lots of miles on, all the O-rings might be going out at once, so it could be a good opportunity to replace them all. It really depends. So we're back in the daytime now. So we've identified the leak in this particular system here, which is this coupling right here. So what you can do with that is actually buy an O-ring and gasket set, and that covers everything for the whole vehicle, all the connections. It includes the O-rings and also the washers as well, which are special washers. They're sort of like a metal ring with a rubber on the inside, and they usually couple the pipes here to the compressor and things like that. So when you do buy something like an O-ring kit, it'll include everything you need for the whole system. So depending where your leak is, it might be a different problem. It could be damage in the line here, in which you would unbolt this section of the line and back here and replace the whole, segment of AC line. That could happen as well. It could be the condenser, maybe a rock chipped up and damaged some of the fins and you need to replace the condenser there. So it does vary, and I can't really give all the possible advice and solutions for each particular problem, but this is a good indication on how you actually detect AC leaks. If you can't actually find the leak at all, you've looked around the whole system and it's just leaking out, then you may want to check the evaporator back there. It's pretty much the only component you can't see because it lives behind the dash and behind the firewall in there. So that's a good point of contact if you have like a major leak and you just can't find out where it's coming from. So I would suspect the evaporator back there. So once you've repaired your system, you'll need to pull a vacuum, get rid of all the contaminants, perhaps replace the receiver dryer as well, and then recharge the system. I have videos on how to do this. I'll link them all in the description below so you can check those out and get your car back on the road with a nice ice cold AC. So I hope this video helped you, and thanks for watching.